Welcome back to Forbidden Knowledge News. I'm your host, Chris Matthew, and tonight I'd like to welcome esoteric and occult researcher and host of the Proud to Be Profane podcast on the Schism 206 YouTube channel, Michael Joseph. How you doing tonight, Michael?
Great. How are you? Thanks for having me on.
I am excellent. Thank you for coming on tonight. And you do an excellent job on your channel. I always wonder, how the elites view their doctrine and their beliefs and how they impose it on us. And you do a great job of kind of dissecting all this information. But before we get into any of it, I'd like to get a little bit about your background and what got you started doing this.
Sure. I'll try to keep it the short version, but basically, I guess around the time of the Boston bombing, that's when I kind of woke up to some of the suspicious things around the media events, especially the big ones like that, 9/11, whatever. And, throughout my life, I'd always had kind of suspicions about lots of things, social engineering and people in power doing nefarious things. And it's not that I have a problem with people in power or aristocracy per se. It's just the morals behind those people. That's more what I have a problem with, if they're not following any at all, or a particular set for them and imposing other things on other people. So, it wasn't really like a shock for me. Like, it broke my world down and I had this cognitive dissonance. It was almost like more like, oh, wow, this makes a lot more sense. It's like, so what ended up happening was, I came across somebody who I consider a good friend now. I was in a band at the time, and he ran our practice space, and my drum and I went up there because of a snare drum problem, and he's good at fixing things, and it ended up being like this 2-hour conversation about the New World Order that he gave us. I was a little less terrified about it than our drummer was, but so from then on, it was just like, that's just something I never really heard about, but it was interesting. And then, as tends to happen, you start noticing things, or you sort of seek things out, but things also kind of happen organically, and then I started stumbling across some different researchers, like Mark Passio is one of the original ones where he talked about occult aspects to 9/11 and just in general. And, I'm the kind of person that I listen to a lot of different viewpoints. I don't necessarily agree with them all, or maybe at the time I'm open to it, and then later down the road I change my mind on certain things. But that was one of the people I watched the whole "What on Earth is Happening" in like just a few nights. Like I'm the kind of person that when I get into something, I really absorb a lot, and I just kind of get a little obsessive about it. And at that time, I was working really hard to pursue music, and kind of had a delusional dream about being a professional musician that, in hindsight, you don't realize your delusion until you actually kind of pull yourself out of it.
Hey, I've been there. I had that same delusion for a while, my friend.
Yeah. I still do things. I mean, my YouTube channel originally, before all this stuff, was just me playing guitar videos like 10 years ago or something like that. So, so basically you absorb a lot from what you see on YouTube, where people are saying this and that, and you're not really doing a whole lot of research on your own. And then it came time where, you start asking some serious questions about what you're being given in the alternative or truther media world. And I started to kind of like, fact check, I guess, like some of the claims. And that's when I started reading a lot of this stuff. I kind of absorbed, I guess, the more esoteric worldview, where it's like there's occult knowledge, it's not good or bad, but the people in control just use it the bad way. And then I sort of absorbed the more like Protestant Christian vibe on the conspiracy world, biblical prophecy, book of Revelation, all that kind of stuff. And so to me, these are like what I now consider to be kind of like these two pillars of I kind of view it as like a dialectic. I almost view it like left and right politics is just on a different plane. That's where I'm at with it now. It took me a long time to realize that, and that's just my own personal perception on it all. But either way, I would be looking at both sides and seeing what they're promoting as, you know, who's the bad guys, or what's bad, how does the evil work, and then what's the solution, what's the good thing. And I found some things that were pretty interesting that they tended to agree on without even really knowing it, and then some things that they would kind of bash each other on, but they kind of misunderstood other aspects of their viewpoints. And so it's kind of like both sides kind of slandering each other for things that I didn't really think they deserve, but at the same time, I sympathize with both sides on certain aspects. And so I was caught in that middle ground between those two pillars. And the work that I've done recently has sort of been unifying them and looking at the battle of Western civilization with like the old world order and the Catholic Empire versus like the New World Order, which I think is more in line with like Talmudic Judaism, with a lot of these esoteric, I guess, occult viewpoints as its religion for the Gentiles in a way. So that's kind of where I'm at with it all now.
Very good. Now, would you agree, based on your research, that, you know, these elites and the powers in control have used their belief in their religion to sort of steer humanity in which direction they want them to go, whether it be in the ancient times with religion, and eventually with politics, and now they have media, and, you know, they're not hiding it much nowadays, but, you know, give us your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a complicated issue because really that's what I kind of realize, is that religion drives our world, and it depends on which viewpoint is more prominent. Sort of like these scales where you know, after Constantine allows Christianity, and with the Edict of Milan in 313, that's where the Catholic scales are you know, weighing down, and that's the first 1,000 years of Christianity and the, you know, European Christendom. And then around the times of the French Revolution, the American Revolution, things are kind of at that equilibrium point. There's both power on both sides, and then the New World Order starts weighing down the other side from then on out. And now I think we're in the kind of the really heavy influence of it. And so with the esoteric aspects and religion, I think that it's sort of like an esoteric, exoteric thing, but I think that that's actually applied to things like Freemasonry and Theosophy and stuff like that, where they claim they have the esoteric knowledge, but I actually think that they're just what I call a golem of more like Talmudic Jewish Kabbalah at the top. And so when you talk about like utilizing these things and things coming out of Hollywood and stuff like that, I think that this is sort of part of these sort of Kabbalistic end times prophecies, where they're indoctrinating people into this religion that is, it's sort of like, in a way, it mirrors the idea of Christianity, whatever you think about it, you know, Christ's death opening things up for the Gentiles. And now it's almost like a reversal of that, where it's the Talmudic Christ or anointed opening up their secret doctrines for the rest of the world. And it's pretty interesting that there's this association called Universal Kabbalah through B'nai Baruch. And if you read some of their end times prophecy stuff on their version, this is like, you know, they're trying to give a universal Kabbalah to the world. They're talking about the evil forces of Rome, you know, the Roman Catholic Church and stuff like that, uniting against basically Israel. And this kind of epic battle. It's really wild if you read it, and it's sort of I don't know. It's kind of like, I think that's like the hidden battle. And so a lot of this stuff that comes out of Hollywood, you know, it's promoting Gnosticism, occultism, stuff like that. And if you look into history, you'll find that these reactions of a lot of these Jewish sects, again, I'm kind of using a broad scope here. There's always distinctions and different variations in between, but we're involved in creating Gnosticism and Freemasonry in its more primitive forms. And if you read certain books, what I try to do also is I try to go into the occult textbooks, people like Albert Pike, Madame Blavatsky, stuff like that. I try to go into university history on the topics, which tends to get very expensive. And so the reason I mention that is there's a Brill book called, I think it's Gnostica Judaica Catholica, super expensive book. I was able to get a copy, but you start reading through this and you start realizing that some of these ideas of Gnosticism, like Sophia and Yaldabaoth, and this Sophia is this principle of wisdom, and it's in exile and persecuted by the quote unquote demiurge. And you start to realize that this is actually the formulation of the Jewish reaction to their power being lost and dispersed and the destruction of the temple and stuff like that. That the book basically posits that that's the best presupposition for understanding that myth. And so you see a lot of those Gnostic things coming out of Hollywood and stuff like that. So it's pretty interesting. And then, you know, for better or for worse, in the truther world, there's a lot of Gnosticism going around. But my personal opinion on it is that it's kind of a deception, but that's just me. And my whole series, my new series, goes into all the reasons why. I can't really get into them all here because it would be a very long show.
Right.
So
now,
that's the reason why a lot of it's coming out. That's just personal observation.
right, and you had mentioned kind of bringing forth an end time scenario. I notice a lot of Hollywood and TV shows have that end time scenario, you know, a lot more than usual. Are they trying to kind of bring forth some sort of scenario like that, some kind of end times?
Well, I think that you have to understand the difference between the Catholic version of the Book of Revelation and the Protestant one. Generally speaking, again, Protestantism tends to encompass a very wide variety of things. But there's sort of like this Christian Zionism built around Protestantism, especially like the mega churches are the ones that you're going to find more in the mainstream. And, you know, from the Catholic standpoint, Revelation was the persecution of the Christians after Christ until, you know, the Christianity gets established as a religion by Constantine. And so that's why Nero is 666 through Gematria. And then some manuscripts, I believe, have 616, which ends up being the Latin version of Gematria for his name. So it's pretty interesting that the Catholic viewpoint has a reason for the 616. And then that, you know, at that time, Rome was the beast that hadn't become Catholic yet. And so that's the whole point about, you know, the city at Seven Hills and, you know, all these sorts of things. And then that's their understanding of the Book of Revelation. And it's not that it can't have some parallels to today, but those things, those events have like already happened in that context. Whereas Protestantism tends to view these things as things to come. And a lot of it will center around Israel as being the, where these things are fulfilled. So the difference is in Catholicism that the Catholic Church is the new Israel. There's no other Israel out there. Whereas Zionism, that's a different Israel. And that's what's the main difference. And obviously Catholicism today is very different. There's a lot of the tactics of infiltration and stuff like that. I played a heavy hand in this. So a lot of this was my problem. I actually didn't really understand the history of the church very well at all. And there's a reason for that, I think. And, you know, this is a lot of traditional Catholic stuff that I'm just kind of coming across now. So I'm not an expert on it all, but somebody like E. Michael Jones is well-versed in these sorts of things. But so it depends on what you mean by end times, because it means different things to different people. And so the Kabbalah Zohar will have its own version of end times. And then the Protestant type Christianity will have its own version, which it's almost like now on YouTube, anybody can interpret Revelation and make a video and get a bunch of followers on it. You know what I mean? And so, but generally speaking, it seems to me that the Christian Zionism version of it only really helps out I guess the Talmudic viewpoint. And what I mean by Talmudic, there's some interesting books that people might want to check out. Jesus in the Talmud by, I believe it's Peter Schaefer. That's a really revelatory book. That's more like an academic book. And then Michael Hoffman's Judaism Strange Gods, which is more of a conspiratorial one and a little bit more overtly like a Christian slant to the narrative. But it really exposes a lot of strange things that you'll find in the Talmud that really go hand in hand with a lot of stuff that you see today. And then you couple that with like more conspiratorial documents, whether you believe them to be true or not, like the Protocols of Zion and stuff like that. There's a lot of things that kind of synchronize pretty well together. And so it's really up to your own interpretation on it. But as far as I understand it, those are kind of like the competing ones, as best as I can explain now. And, like I said, as I come across new information, it tweaks how I view things and stuff. That's where I'm at with it now.
Right. Now, earlier you had mentioned being esoteric or exoteric, and the name of your podcast is Proud to be Profane. Kind of, for those who may not know, what's the difference between esoteric and exoteric, and what it is to be profane?
Well, generally speaking, in like, I don't know, theosophy or Freemasonry, the profane are the ignorant. They're ignorant of the secret doctrine, or, their understanding of reality, which they believe to be the truth. And so most of that is tied from those viewpoints to the idea of an impersonal deity that is it's outside of creation, but it's also impersonal to creation, and it's just sort of this emanating oneness or principle. It's the Ein Sof of Kabbalah, Parabrahma of Hinduism. There's different names for it, but this is like in Kabbalah, there's like a tree of life, which is like the visible world in the universe at the top. And then outside of that is the Ein Sof R, which is the spirit of that deity. So Theosophy, for example, Madame Blavatsky will talk how this relates to the Hindu understanding of the impersonal God, and then there's all these emanations, and it's all of these deities are just allegories for principles of nature and stuff like that. And then there's like a hierarchy or a chain of these principles, and part of that associated with like ritual magic is like tapping into these principles and stuff like that. So this is why like the Gnostic system of aeons and stuff like that kind of corresponds with this. And Hinduism, according to her version of it, again, they tend to co-opt things and make things unified, but there are distinctions and other viewpoints that they tend to leave out that are kind of important. And so that's kind of like the biggest thing, versus what's profane is like belief in a personal deity. And what's pretty interesting is that usually there's pagan concepts to that. So for example, the God of Catholic Christianity is seen to be a personal deity, and Eastern Orthodox too. People like Jay Dyer do lots of debates around this. And
Had Jay on the other night.
Oh yeah. He's very good with like debating these philosophical aspects of it. I'm not so much as good with like the hardcore philosophy. I like to I'm more of applying it to social situations, engineering, and history. But either way, the personal deity is what is profane. And so that is sort of my kind of joke on the podcast, Proud to be Profane, because I don't accept the Theosophy or Freemasonry as the truth. I think there's things within it that have some things that are true or profound or insightful, but as a whole system, I certainly don't accept it. And a lot of that had to do with my personal delving into the readings and philosophies, where at one time I was very open to it all, and so that's part of it. But then also any religion that is tied to that, and especially Christianity in particular. So if you want to talk about the Satan or the adversary of occultism, it would essentially be like, you know, the Catholic Church and the Christian Empire. And so this gets into the strange breakdown through the Protestant Reformation, and then leading up to the Enlightenment, and then leading up to, like, you know, the New World and the Anglo-American Empire, and you know, basically all of those kind of deistic Enlightenment principles that the country was founded upon. And so you'll see it's kind of interesting, like the Protestant Reformation's in 1517, I believe. Then 200 years later, almost like right on the mark, that's when Freemasonry officially starts, 1717. And then 200 years later, that's when you have the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. And so it's almost like the breakdown has been like the Protestantism was the first phase, and then the Masonic deistic Enlightenment principles, and then the Jewish Revolution through the Bolsheviks and stuff like that. So that's kind of like the reversal in a way, or the scales, you know, changing. So that's how I understand it. And the profane, like I said, there's buzz terms for it. I actually look at, there we go. This is from a video I've been headed out. This is the devil card in tarot. So this is an hieroglyph for ignorance, darkness, superstition, stuff like that. And all of these are Enlightenment buzzwords to describe the first 1,000 years of Christianity, or the Middle Ages, or the quote unquote Dark Ages, as they call them. But what's also very interesting about that time, at least the first 1,000 years, is that, you know, there were usury laws. It was prohibited. There was no fractional reserve banking, and Jewish power and oligarchy was kept in check. And that was the teaching of Catholicism. And so how interesting is it that we call that the Dark Ages now? And the Enlightenment illuminates or enlightens those Dark Ages. And this is really about the French Revolution and all of these sordid things that were going on there, which are documented by Augustin Barruel and Memoirs of Jacobinism, where you start reading the letters from certain people like Voltaire, Frederick the Great, and all of those people. And they admit openly in their letters to each other that they're following the mysteries of Mithras. They're going to illuminate the masses by degrees. They're in line with the spirit of Julian the Apostate. They actually are creating the encyclopedia as a propaganda tool to start changing definitions over time, to install philosophy and basically destroy Catholic France through the Revolution. And you know, then those ideas spread out, and then the Jacobins take over, and they're like the crazy Antifa back then, and people start getting beheaded, and all this bad shit goes down. So that's an incredible book to document a lot of this. And I guess I'll shut up for a bit, because it's easy to.
No, that's fascinating. What types of it seems like a mix-max of religions that the elites are using, just bits and pieces of different types of beliefs and religions in ancient doctrine. Is that, you know, accurate?
Yeah, I think what it really comes down to, if you view it at least from the narrative of European history, and, you know, like kind of like a Catholic Jewish power struggle, there's a certain amount of pragmatism to it. And there's one concept, it's called the golem, which is basically taking dead matter. And if you view the profane as dead matter, then they could essentially become a golem. And so what a golem is putting a little spark of the rabbinical wisdom into dead matter, and then this golem can avenge the Jewish people from its persecution, its enemies, or anti-Semitism. And so what's interesting is you'll find echoes of some of these Talmudic ideas in Freemasonry, in Gnosticism, in Theosophy, stuff like that. And so, for example, Madame Blavatsky straight up says that the true Freemasons, or she calls them the true Templars, they follow the doctrines of the Talmud as Jesus being Jesus ben Pantera, the son of a Roman soldier. That's the story from the Talmud. But they don't view it as they're kind of missing a component where the Talmud is very polemical to Christ, or they call Jesus the Nazarene and stuff like that. And that's why Jesus in the Talmud, if you read that book, it outlines this clearly. Now, there's a lot of excuses that are given in saying, well, that's not the Jesus of the Gospels. But the guy who wrote that book says the onus is on them to prove that. And basically that's sort of like a way of getting around it. And so what's really interesting about it is this is confirmed in the Gospels too, whether you believe them, whatever you believe about Christ or Christianity. I'm just talking about the battles here going on. The Pharisees view Jesus as a demon, basically. They think he's like a heretic, or he's of the nations, he's of the Gentiles. They think he's pagan, essentially, or he's got a pagan demon attached to him. And so this is the battle. And so what's interesting in the Talmud, you'll find that same thing where he's a heretic, and Mary, or Miriam, the mother, she's a harlot or a whore. She's a prostitute. It's almost like, it's, like when you know somebody and they're raging out, and then they're like, they're angry at something that, like, they're being irrational. And so they start like casting all of these stones at something, but it doesn't make any logical sense. Like, they'll say one thing, but it's always a polemic, if you can see what I'm saying. So if you start reading the Talmud's view on Christ, it's like none of them are really that coherent, but they're always like really angry about Christ in the Talmud. So again, he's the son of a Roman soldier. And again, a Roman soldier is a heathen at that time to them. And so he's a bastard of a Roman soldier, and then marries a whore or a harlot. Or, there's like these parallels to Hiram Abiff being Hiram of Tyre being associated with Christ. And Hiram of Tyre is seen as a pagan king. And so he's not viewed as in a very good light from the Talmud's perspective. But you see this echoed in Freemasonry, where if you read the Freemasonic definition of Hiram of Tyre, he's like, Hiram is sort of associated with Christ in Freemasonry, because that's kind of like the equality Christ, all these deities equal, Krishna, Osiris, whatever. And so Hiram Abiff's death and resurrection ritual is supposed to parallel that. And so what's interesting is, if you read Hiram of Tyre, there's two Hirams. It's easy to get confused, but they're both part of the same biblical story. Hiram of Tyre has like this Freemasonic wisdom, but he defers to Solomon. So he's deferring to, the Jewish bloodline as being the one with the real wisdom. And so isn't that kind of interesting with the idea of a golem, where you see these echoes of Talmudic thought, but it's changed because Freemasonry will think, well, it's illuminating to understand Christ as the astro-theological one, that's Krishna, Osiris, whatever. And that's like part of the illumination process, but it's making him equal with everything else. And what's also interesting is that, Mary becomes equilibrated with Isis and Astarte and all these other female deities. But you start to realize that Freemasonry and Theosophy revere the Talmud and the Kabbalah and all these sorts of things. And even Freemasonry admits that their doctrines go back to Philo as being one of the most important people involved in it. And he was from Jewish aristocracy tied to banking and mercantile bloodlines, omitted on the Jerusalem Post site. And so is there an agenda to infuse some of this rabbinical wisdom into these golems to attack their enemy, which is Christ and his harlot of a mother, as they call it? But they don't get that version of it. And so what's really happening is they're actually equilibrating Mary with Isis, and they're calling it illumination, but the rabbis are saying, yes, that's a curse. Thank you. You know what I mean? You can see what I'm saying. And so you start seeing this with lots of different things. You start seeing with the Protestants. The Protestants will say, the Roman Catholic Church views, they're the whore of Babylon, right? Mary is just Isis. They almost have the same view as the Freemasons, but they don't call it illumination. They think it's evil, right? Whereas the Freemasons call it illumination, but they think that the Catholic Church stole it from them. And so either way, they're both attacking the enemy of these Talmudic Kabbalists, which is pretty interesting because that's what the golem's supposed to do. And you start realizing that Martin Luther, when he was making his Reformation, he was using a lot of Jews who fled from Spain, from the Inquisition and the expulsion. They started helping him with the Bible, along with these humanist scholars, which are kind of tied to progressive ideas that really lead down to transhumanism in their logical conclusion. And so these humanist scholars were kind of seen as sort of heretics, and that's what people were like looking out for. But the point is, they were kind of helping Luther form his opinion on the Bible, and he was trying to reject certain books and all these sorts of things. And finally, all the way down the road, it ends up with 66 books, and 66 books is a very Kabbalistic number. I think in the Catholic Bible, there's 73 books, and in the Old Testament, I think it's, I can't remember. I think it's 30 or 46, maybe. Whatever. Either way, so in the Protestant one is 39. And so what's interesting about the number 39, that's the Old Testament, and in Gnosticism, they want to reverse the context of the Old Testament, or in Theosophy, where they view that very differently. So there's these weird reversal curses that go on. So the number 39, when you reverse it, is 93, and that's a Crowley number. And so that's the number of thelema, or will, in the New Testament. But what is that will, right? Will is a word, the will of God. How do you define God? How do you find God's will? So the Talmudic elite's will of God would be very different than the Catholic's will of God versus, I don't know, whoever else's will of God, right? And so you start seeing a coherent pattern where the church is attacked in a certain way as being, you know, pagan and a harlot and all that kind of stuff. But then you realize that that's how the Talmud views it, and you see these sorts of Jewish influences that are formulating Freemasonry and Protestantism behind the scenes without people really knowing it. And then Martin Luther had a very bipolar experience with the Jews that helped him, where he was very accepting and open, and then all of a sudden he writes this book on like the Jews and their lives, which is seen as like one of these things that was fueling like Nazism or something like that. And so like way down the road, because you know it's Protestant Germany, and so it's just interesting to see that bipolar reaction. But either way, the result is 66 books of the Bible, and then Protestantism tends to be the most Zionist form of Christianity out there. And then you get into like John Dee and the Elizabethan Empire. There's a book by this guy, Jason Louv. I don't agree with his narrative on it, but it's a fantastic book to illustrate this point, that the angels that Dee was talking to were saying, you need to form a new world order empire, and this is a whole new way of, you know, dealing with Christianity. And so that ended up becoming the Anglo-American establishment, and the kind of the hammer to spread the new gospel, so to speak, of a transmuted understanding of Christianity. And you wonder if the Protestants were really that aware of that this was going on, because again, it's kind of like a breakdown from different mindsets. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, no, very interesting. Now, how much of the writings of Blavatsky, Pike, Hall, how much of that do you think they're really going by? And is any of it just kind of thrown in to confuse the quote unquote profane?
I think it can be a bit of all of that, you know. I think that it's created for certain purposes, again, to attack its enemies. But at the same time, there's sort of like, I'm sure lots of groups that are powerful that do believe in this stuff as being the truth. Like, for example, the United Nations, they're following the teachings of Theosophy, Madame Blavatsky, and this is openly admitted on their Lucis Trust Spiritual Foundation website. You can go read all about it. They talk about bringing the age of Aquarius and harmony through conflict and all these things. And you know, the Luciferian principle, the way they understand Lucifer, it's this active principle, this active fire that goes through the cycles of evolution and eventually will rise back up and create this, you know, utopia or this unity consciousness, that kind of thing. So you got the UN, which is kind of an important organization, following this teaching. And I would argue that there's probably a lot of people there that actually believe in it, but perhaps the people who are really trying to influence that institution don't necessarily believe all of that, but maybe they were like the creators of it for a purpose, right? Because like, you know, again, there's a lot of attractive sounding things. There's a lot of nice sounding things that sound philosophical. They sound humanitarian. it sounds very nice. I'm not going to, and I think that also Freemasonry and Theosophy are attacked in unfair ways by overzealous Christians, especially. And this is what I kind of, the satanic panic kind of stuff. And this is something that I've never, it always kind of pissed me off. Like I found myself defending, especially in my occult science series, defending Blavatsky, Pike, people like Crowley from some of the sensational claims made against them. Even if I don't agree with their philosophies, I still wouldn't, I don't like it when things are attacked in an unfair way, even if I don't agree with it, because then it's not being honest, if you can see what I'm saying. And so, you know, it's really what I think it's a useful tool. And there are some true things in it. There are some good insights. There are some good critiques, I think, of Pike and Blavatsky on particular viewpoints, even on Christianity itself in particular instances. But there's a lot of strange stuff in there that you realize once you go through history, who are the heroes according to like Albert Pike. You know, he says Napoleon's a great hero. Charlemagne, on some level, Cromwell. What's interesting is all of these people basically, you know, liberated the Jews and allowed them into power on some level. So that's a pretty interesting coincidence that's what Freemasonry and their mindsets and who they're revering is doing. And so again, is that an indicator of who actually created it, and they're just not aware of it, especially when you have all of this reverence for Solomon's temple. A lot of the rituals are based on you know, these sort of biblical concepts, even though they'll tie it to Hindu stuff or Egyptian mystery religion and things like that. But the other part is you have to think about stuff like the Babylonian captivity, where in Blavatsky's eyes, that was a good thing. That's where the Jews got the secret doctrine, and that's what allowed them to know the truth. Whereas in Catholicism, that's where they got all the mysticism that deceives humanity. So you have a complete bipolar viewpoint on these things, and that's why the interpretation matters. And that's my main issue with Freemasonry and Theosophy and stuff like that. I think it overgeneralizes a lot of things and doesn't make distinctions that should be made, and that really kind of tear apart some of their foundations on certain things. But it's a lot of word magic, like you know, you hear things like, oh, Solomon, right? Sol, the sun, Om, like Om, and then On, the Egyptian deity. They'll say, see there, that's proof that this comes from like some sun worship, something like that. But like, where does the word Solomon come from? In Hebrew, it's Shlomo, and that doesn't sound like any of those things. So it only works in English. So to me, that's the word magic. Well, when you actually go back to where these things come from, a lot of times they don't sound the same, so that argument kind of falls apart. But that's the mysticism of it. It sounds interesting, and that's part of Kabbalah too. You speak things into existence, and then phonating something, the vibration of the voice has an important part of this creation. And so I think that this is kind of all involved in this stuff on some level. And then there's an example in Jesus in the Talmud. There's an incredibly interesting curse that's placed where I believe it's the Greek word panentheros, and then there's parthenos. I can't remember exactly. I have it in my videos, but the point is they reverse some letters in those words, and that it's the Greek word for virgin, so like Virgin Mary, right? And they reversed it with the Greek word for panther. That's why he's Jesus ben Pantera, Pantheros. It's panther. So you're taking the virgin birth or Virgin Mary and making her into a beast, right? A panther, right? And so that in the book, it admits that this is a tactic that Judaism is used to like make curses against Christianity. And so just when you start reading some of these things, it's very telling that you see those things echoed in Protestantism and occultism to attack the church. And then you see all of those strange Kabbalistic parallels to them. You wonder, where does this stuff really comes from versus where the Theosophists and Freemasons say it comes from? I guess that's my point.
Now, I'm glad you said the satanic panic. They see Lucifer as something completely different than, you know, what modern day Christians would consider the devil. Could you talk a little bit about how they view Lucifer?
Yeah, like I said, it's this pure spirit of Ein Sof of Kabbalah. That would be a synonym for it. So it's this androgynous unity of infinite oneness, infinite whatever, I guess, infinity. And the point is, out of this oneness, these principles just kind of emanate, and then the material world comes out. So the creator of the material world is not the highest God, as opposed to, you know, Catholicism. And so that is the active principle of Lucifer, is like the fire of Prometheus. It's the intellect. It's the initiatory force, right? And then there's like the passive principle of it, which is more like Venus, the harmony, the androgyny. That's why it's always like musicians, they kind of push like these androgynous musicians and stuff like that. That's utilizing like the Venus principles of Lucifer. And that's kind of like what Blavatsky writes about, or what Lucius Trust writes about, the divine solar angels that descended from Venus to enlighten mankind. So this is all seen as like, essentially the consciousness of mankind is these principles. So mankind is Lucifer, essentially. That's what they're kind of saying. But it's a rewritten understanding where all it represents is this principle that goes through cycles of evolution, and that Darwinian evolution is true, but the materialists don't understand there's a spiritual component too, and this is what they tie to Hinduism. This Hindu evolution, reincarnation, man becomes a rock or a plant or an animal, and then humans or something like that. And what's also very interesting about this is, if you tie it back to the Talmudic viewpoint, and that the Gentiles are viewed as beasts or cattle, it's funny how the doctrines of evolution equate you with cattle. At one point, I was a cattle, like through the cycle of Darwinian evolution. And then there's also these interesting concepts behind the Am Haaretz, which are kind of like heretical or ignorant Jews of the Talmud. And they're kind of like seen as on this similar level with the Goyim, and how they're not allowed to eat meat. So to me, it's part of the vegan vegetarian agenda is to equilibrate humans with animals, right? That the animals' rights, we're eating what the cows eat, the cattle eat, we're eating vegetables. You know what I mean? Like there's a lot of stuff I did in the research going into this stuff, and you find that a lot of this vegetarian stuff comes from the Fabian Society, especially in the early 1900s. There was like a big push for this. There's the World Council of Religions in I think it's 1893, where like the Rockefellers are at, all these like Indian guru swamis. So to me, I think that the Indian system of religion, I think that these elites find it useful because I mean, again, this doesn't mean to be offensive to people out there, but I just think it creates a lot of passivity, and a lot of it is about, oh, everything's an illusion. We're all in an illusion. So what does it matter? Or like, it's just about your spiritual evolution. Who cares about everything else? It's kind of Gnostic in a way, like material world doesn't really matter. And that's very different in Catholicism. And, Catholicism incorporated a lot of Greek philosophy into it, like, Aristotle or whatever. And so this is why you'll find things in like the Cosmos series with Neil deGrasse Tyson and Carl Sagan. You'll find subtle bashes of Aristotle, or their heroes will be Giordano Bruno or Hypatia of Alexandria. And if you watched Carl Sagan's last episode of Cosmos, the 13th episode of Cosmos, it's all about the Great Library of Alexandria and this Alexandrian cosmopolitan paradise that is sort of like paradise lost to them. And you find out that's where these Jews had their power in Alexandria, like Philo of Alexandria. There's a lot of that culture, the more liberal culture, came from there. So it's kind of interesting. And then even Blavatsky will talk about how the Talmudic wisdom was at the Great Library of Alexandria, and then it gets scattered to different areas and stuff like that. And so you just see a complete reversal of these two understandings of European history. But again, you have to look more into I call it the esoteric Catholic version, something like The Plot Against the Church by Maurice Pinet, or E. Michael Jones' Jewish Revolutionary Spirit, something like that. If you understand that mindset more properly, rather than like, especially post-Vatican II, and this sort of like, honestly, like more like Freemasonic Catholicism, which is kind of more what it's like today in certain ways. And, the Pope Francis, New World Order, globalization and infinite immigration, all that kind of stuff. Again, there's a process of infiltration, stuff like that. So it's more complex than just good, bad, or something like that in an all-encompassing way. But so to sum it up, I mean, the doctrines, I think, are useful on one level for a power structure that's very, very much in control of a lot of things. And then there's also people that probably really believe these things and believe they're doing good because there is a lot of nice sounding stuff in it, but perhaps they're missing some key components. And unfortunately, it just makes you a useful person. And I'm sure there's a lot of people in like the UN that are really thinking they're doing a lot of good, but really there's a lot of suspicious stuff going on. And the UN is now pushing all this vegan, vegetarian stuff as well.
Now, what are your thoughts on the significance of elite bloodlines and, you know, the possibility you hear, oh, they may have off-planet origin or divine origin? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the bloodlines thing, I don't get too caught up in that in some all-encompassing way, because there's sort of this tendency, and again, I think that this is sort of like a trick, an alchemical trick, because alchemy is about equilibrium. You're taking two opposites and you try to equilibrate them and transmute a mindset. And so I talk about this in my newer series, how if you want to neutralize your enemy, like say, for example, you know, things that are dangerous to the New World Order establishment, people speaking out about 9/11 deception, lies, chemtrails, any dangers of vaccines, Federal Reserve System, any of those things that people mostly can agree on are not good for humanity. And you're speaking out against those things. Well, is there a way to neutralize those people? They're going to speak out against that anyways. So is there a way you can get them to also attack your enemy and then, okay, let them speak these things that are against us as long as they're promoting these other things that help us, if you can see what I'm saying. It's just a tactic of warfare, neutralizing your enemy. And so that's what I think happens a lot with like the ideas of Saturn, right? People always say, oh, Saturn is evil, they worship it, and all these things. But like you have to understand, well, what does Saturn really mean? And it's in more astrological terms, it's like functions of authority, restriction, limitation. But are those things always bad, right? And so if you get this sort of Marxist authority always bad, aristocracy always bad, bloodlines always bad, then you're constantly a revolutionary, and that's how they take advantage of you. They have you on your, you know, I'm on my crusade with my pitchfork to march to Frankenstein's castle, but you just see these things that look like a monster because you've been engineered to think it is, and then you just wind up and go, and it's useful, right? And so for me, like the bloodline things, I look at like the European aristocracy. There's an interesting book. It's kind of intense, but it has a lot of interesting things in it. It's called The Plot Against the Church. I mentioned it earlier, by Maurice Pinet. It's just a pseudonym, Maurice Pinet, for a bunch of high up Catholic clergy before Vatican II that saw what was happening, and they wanted to give the esoteric version of Catholic history and pass it around because they were really concerned about what was going on. At least that's my understanding of it. But the point is, the Catholic bloodlines, the Bourbons, you know, et cetera, and Stuarts kind of hop back and forth between Catholicism and Protestantism. But the point of that book is that it was very difficult for these infiltrators to get into the positions of government because it was based upon nobility, right? You have to be in these bloodlines. And, you know, again, it depends on what the situation is. And so that's kind of the reasoning for getting rid of all the monarchies in Europe or co-opting ones. So the French Revolution got rid of the French monarchy, the Bourbons. Louis XVI beheaded. Charles I was beheaded. And then from then on, Britain pretty much remained with a Protestant monarch. The czars of Russia, you know, the Bolshevik Revolution took out Nicholas II and murdered his entire family. So that's what Augustin Barruel documents in the Anti-Monarchical Conspiracy, and Maurice Pinet talks about how that was a bulwark against these Talmudic elite from infiltrating. And this is why you get the Converso crisis in Catholic Spain, the Spanish Inquisition. If you read this book by Chris Kamen, this is like a university book that's seen as like the more objective and authoritative version on the Spanish Inquisition. I've read the whole book, and it's very interesting, and it is very objective. But one thing that's very funny about it is that this guy, this author, he got a special visit from Ben Zion Netanyahu, which is Benjamin Netanyahu's father. He's not alive anymore, but he was an Israeli historian for specifically the Jews in Spain. And basically, that Ben Zion Netanyahu influence came in to basically promote, and especially in the first 3 chapters, that there's no evidence of any Jewish conspiracy to infiltrate the church. And I'd say that's a conflict of interest if you have the Israeli prime minister's father telling you that this is how you need to view the Jews in Spain. No Jewish conspiracy, right? And so this was why the Inquisition happened to begin with. It had nothing to do, the Inquisition couldn't do anything to people who were Jews. The Jews lived by themselves, and they were allowed to live by themselves, and they weren't supposed to harass them as long as they, weren't stirring up any problems. And the same thing with the Muslim communities. And you only got put in the Inquisition if you were a Christian and you were, committing heresy, right? So they weren't just hunting down pagans. The pagans weren't Christians. So like people have these misconceptions, like the Inquisition just looked for any free thought and just burnt them. You know what I mean? Like that's kind of the view we get. But what really was going on was that there were Jewish people converting to Christianity, and and some of them were sincere. Some of them might not have been. And some of them that might have been actually plotting to overtake it because they were left in, the pogroms. And so what's interesting is then all these people start converting, and then all these, the shitstorm starts happening. And so that's the whole point of why the Inquisition came about to begin with. And so they're trying to get into the aristocracy. They're trying to get into the bloodlines. And the Maurice Pinay, they said that they successfully infiltrated the British aristocracy. It took them a long time. And that's interesting that they're one of the royal families that's still allowed to do their thing, the rest of them they had to take out. And so another great example of this coming out of Hollywood, have you seen The Matrix? I'm sure.
Of course, yeah.
You know how the Merovingian's the bad guy, and he's this French asshole who, likes wiping his ass with souk or whatever, And so what's interesting is that the Merovingian kings, they were, according to Jewish historians, I think Gretz is one of them, they didn't let the Jews into power. Basically, they were very good about keeping their power suppressed and protecting their homeland, because that's where they were from. They were pagan kings who converted to Catholicism, so this is their land, and they're choosing to follow a particular religion. So the baptism of Clovis is seen as this miracle event, and so those were the kings. Despite them not being able to behave themselves all the time, they had a problem with sexual immorality. And that was what the Christians were trying to help them solve, but some were better than others about it. And so that's another thing. It's a very human process, this conversion. But they didn't let the Jews into power because they thought they were a threat to their kingdom. And so they're just protecting their homeland. And so how interesting is it out of Hollywood, the Merovingians are the bad guys. They're the bad bloodline. And then they're the ones that are supposed to be the bloodline of Christ. And he married Mary Magdalene, who's a prostitute. So now they're making Jesus equivalent with a prostitute. And that's the Merovingian line. But look what they actually did in history, and what comes out of Hollywood, things start to line up. You can see what I'm saying.
Yeah, in Hollywood, that's a perfect segue to what I want to talk about next, is what I'm noticing coming out of Hollywood. Not only the rampant occult symbolism, I mean, they're not even hiding it anymore. I just see more and more of it. There's on Netflix a lot of witchcraft and occult, but more than anything is the robots and transhumanism. You have any thoughts on what they're trying to push with transhumanism?
Yeah, a lot of that is tied to occultism. My occult science series, it's a very long series. I guess I should have mentioned this at the beginning. Everything I have here is sourced. I try to source it very well, so I'm not just talking out my ass on a lot of these things, because I mean it's easy to, you can't give every source when you're doing an interview, right? But
right, yeah.
So anyways, the point of that series is that it talks about all of the occultism that's embedded in society, and how it's really a religion that people follow whether they know it or not, in a lot of ways. Like if you believe in the Big Bang Theory, you're following the Kabbalistic story of creation. the cosmic egg, the primordial matter. This is stuff you can all find in Blavatsky or Manly Palmer Hall's Secret Teachings of All Ages. It's almost like an exact replica of what you say about the Big Bang. Everything was condensed into a single point, and then the infinite burst into existence from this cosmic egg, and then there's panspermic evolution or something like that. And so where that came from was a Catholic priest. But again, think about the infiltration. If you have a Catholic priest who comes from, I think he came from the Netherlands, and that's where some of the Sephardic Jews fled to, and it's kind of been established that the Dutch had a lot of that influence there. George Lemaitre came up with the Big Bang Theory essentially, and worked with Einstein to varying degrees. And that's like, if you just look at the Kabbalistic story and you listen to what modern science says about the Big Bang, generally speaking, it's almost identical. So is that a coincidence? And so another interesting thing is apparently Pope Pius XII, he's a pope, he's not a scientist. So he's like, oh, is this a proof for Catholicism? And apparently Lemaitre was kind of hostile to him, like, no. Let's keep religion out of it. He like didn't want this to be attached to Catholicism, which was kind of weird. And so if you understand how like some of these infiltrators, or at least they say they work, there's a lot of suspicious stuff around Lemaitre and like how he viewed a lot of this stuff or how he interacted. But anyways, so all that stuff is tied into transhumanism, because that's just the natural evolution of man, right? If we're all just this active principle and everything is this pantheistic oneness, that's essentially, again, the active principle of Lucifer. Well, why not transfer your consciousness into something made by the Promethean intellect of technology? And so, ironically, that's like another golem, if you can see what I'm saying. You're creating crude matter, and then you're infusing a spirit into it, right? And so if it's based on the Big Bang of Kabbalah, what spirit are you infusing into all of this technocracy and transhumanism? I don't know the realities if they could. I mean, I don't believe you can actually transfer your own consciousness into some sort of avatar. People could try. I would highly advise against it, but that's just me, but there's a lot of strange pushes with that. The 2045 Avatar project. You got to go through the occult science series to see all the parallels. There's a lot of parallels to this theosophy in Kabbalah that's infused into the transhumanism. And now they're bringing it to the spiritual idea. And they always use this idea, we can't go back to the dark ages. We need to evolve. And they always use the moon landing as this precursor example for this. So it's like, well, if you believe the moon landing wasn't what they said and maybe didn't even happen, what does that say about all their projections with this transhumanist stuff? If they're saying that that's like one of the pinnacle events that led to this. And, I don't know, but it's really like a lot of the Hindu avatar stuff. It's always based upon Eastern religion on some level. And they're always trying to destroy European Christianity in the process. And that gets into all kinds of different things. But yeah, the Golem and the Adam Kadmon of Kabbalah, that's kind of a similar principle. And then the last thing I'll mention about the transhumanist stuff that's pretty wild is in Blavatsky's writing, she talks about this Promethean prophecy, because Prometheus is a very important figure. And the allegory is he steals the fire from the gods, or he gives you the gnosis, and that evil demiurge doesn't want you to know about it, right? And again, the demiurge is just an allegory for Catholic Christian empire. And so he's the liberator. He's the revolutionary liberating figure. And so that spark of intellect, I mean, that Prometheus is right outside of Rockefeller Center. And that's the point of my occult Catholicism series, is that Rockefeller Center was built in direct opposition to St. Patrick's Cathedral at a time in the 1800s where there was a lot of Catholic immigration and Catholic Church was kind of rising in prominence. And you have all these Protestant polemics during that time about, Romish plots and all these sorts of things. A little side tangent, but that's the point. That, the Rockefellers are one of these WASP establishments that's kind of paved the way for 9/11, and they're the ones that built the Twin Towers, right? And then it got transferred over to Silverstein or whatever. And so you could see the blending of all polarities into one, which is their understanding of God. So you know, this is why you have all the weird gender shit going on. You have all of the the race mixing that is, I don't have a problem with that, but it's promoted and it's encouraged and it's, you know, it's overly represented, it's overly pushed, right? It's the agenda driving it to, you know, destroy Europe basically with mass immigration and all that kind of stuff. And so, you know, who wants to destroy Europe? The monotheism of Europe, and you listen to people like Barbara Specter talk about this, and they say point blank, you know, the Jewish people are going to be spearheading this movement to bring immigration into Europe. And, you know, a lot of these conflicts start to make sense. And so with the transhumanist stuff, to me, it's just control. People getting, I don't have a problem with technology per se in and of itself, depending on, there's a certain ceiling, say, I would hit with it, but like, I don't have a problem with somebody owning an iPhone, but the problem is if people don't have moral restrictions or they don't have discipline, they're going to be enslaved to it. And I find myself struggling with this just like anybody else, and I try really hard not to, but you know, they push this all in Hollywood. Everything is becoming androgynous, right? Merging the sexes, and this gets into, again, the occult deity is this androgynous Abraxas. And so as above, so below, it seems like they're trying to bring that spiritual concept to human beings. And sometimes I just wonder if like the transgender stuff with like Bruce Jenner, who apparently grew up in Newtown, Connecticut, where the Sandy Hook event took place. Very strange. You know, he's like the poster person for this. And you just wonder, is that just a way of debasing society, and let's see what we can get, you know, Western civilization to do, because we hate it, you know, and so let's destroy all of their relationships, get them all obsessed with sex or this or that or whatever, and destroy the culture and debase it. And the more stupid they get, the more we'll be able to dominate and have our control. And then the technology is just to push to do that further, you know. That's what's kind of scary about you know, the stranglehold that it has over us, because if you look into like the Noahide laws and stuff like that, I mean, George Bush signed those into American laws and acts in 1991, around when he had all those New World Order speeches, right? So what New World Order was he talking about when he sang in the Noahide laws? And those things are, you know, on the surface, they sound nice. It's like no idolatry or whatever, but idolatry to them is Christ or Christianity, right? Because we talked about it, like he's a pagan demon according to them. And that's the whole point of the Gospels. It's like the Gospels corroborate the Talmud, but in the inverted way. And so, you know, that's something to consider. And also weird things about the Noahide laws, like they're for sexual morality. And, you know, that tradition, homosexuality is bad. So you wonder if a lot of this push for LGBT stuff is actually trying to destroy American values, and then once they've done their bidding, they're just going to turn on them. So I would actually be, if I was an LGBT activist, I would protest the Noahide laws. Why isn't anybody protesting those? And then also I think they have to do with like preventing witchcraft or something. So you wonder when people get into like tarot and stuff like that in a divinatory way, right? Rather than like the psychological way. Could that be a part of that, you know, because there's this big occult revival, and once that destroys the old world completely, are these Noahide laws just going to turn on you? I mean, that's just a concern I would have, just like with any of the transhumanist stuff where it's all disguised as love and light, and the robots are just going to help us. And the other thing is that the most important transhumanist figure is the Sophia head, right? The Sophia of Gnosticism. And it's just the face, and the face is the top sphere of the Tree of Life in Kabbalah, which encompasses all the other Sephiroth. So, you know, again, go in the transhumanism stuff and the end of the occult science series, and it gets pretty wild.
Definitely. And you had briefly mentioned Sandy Hook. Now, you hear researchers talk about the possibilities of occult aspects to this, maybe even ritualistic aspects to large events like 9/11, even the JFK assassination. I know you've done some research on this. What are your thoughts on that?
On any of those events, or Sandy Hook in particular?
It could be any of those. I mean, just okay. If anything, you know, particular sticks out in your mind about one of those events in particular, we can talk about that.
Yeah, JFK, number one, the most Kabbalistic occult stuff you'll find around any of these events comes from JFK. It's actually kind of mind-blowing, and this gets into the idea of like, well, this, to me, this is beyond human intervention with the JFK stuff. And I have a series on that people can watch. I've done a lot of talks on these things. The best talk to listen to get the full spectrum of it is the talk I did with Tim Kelly of Our Interesting Times podcast. I did a 3-hour talk with him, and on my channel, I posted it with slides so people can see all of the source information, stuff like that. But to try to give a synopsis real quick of the JFK stuff, number one, Dealey Plaza is shaped like the Kabbalah tree of life and reflects the Masonic temple. The directions correspond with this. The best example I can give is outside of the layout itself. There's 3 pillars of Dealey Plaza. There's Commerce Street, Main Street, and Elm Street. And so Elm Street would be the north pillar, the pillar of darkness. And you wonder why Nightmare on Elm Street. Elm Street is kind of like always have a negative connotation. Well, that's the dark pillar on the Masonic temple if you transpose it onto Dealey Plaza. Commerce Street is the right pillar. So that would be Joaquin. The dark pillar would be Boaz, or Elm Street would be Boaz. And the middle pillar is Main, and that's the equilibrium of the two. And so it's the north and south pillar with Main at the center. And what's very interesting is the horizontal streets all split north and south at Main Street. So there's a North Houston and then there's a South Houston, and it splits at the middle pillar, just like would be reflected on the Masonic transposition. And the ritual of Hiram Abiff, he's assailed in the northwest corner of the temple. That's where JFK was shot, and he was killed heading west, and JFK was killed heading west. Hiram Abiff got 3 blows. JFK was shot with 3 bullets. Whether, let's go with the story, right? The narrative of it, whether you believe it to be true or not. The 3 blows were to the neck, chest, and head. JFK, he had bullet fragments in the chest cavity, but the bullet was said to come in the back. So it's kind of like a little reversal. Chest or back, whatever, it's still into the chest cavity. He was hit in the neck, or at least they say that in the Zapruder film. You can see him going like that at one particular point. And then the final blow that kills Hiram Abiff is to the head. And of course, we all know what happened with JFK, or at least as we saw in the Zapruder film. I don't know. There's a lot of theories about that event, how much hoaxery was going on, how much messing with the Zapruder film was there. But it emulates the Hiram Abiff death and resurrection ritual to a T. There's also these other rituals that are built into it that are pretty wild. There's an Azazel scapegoat ritual, which goes back to Leviticus, and then the Kabbalistic understanding of it, it's for sexual iniquity. And of course, think about JFK and the sexual affair with Marilyn Monroe. Whether it happened or not, that's in the minds of the people. This is all about consciousness mindsets. And so she's like the woman in red, the seductress. And then the other part is, if you read Carl Jung's alchemical writings on Mysterium Conjunctionis, I think it's volume 14 of his collected works. I'd have to double check that. But all of the alchemy, there's this concept of an alchemical transmutation of the king, and the king and queen in alchemy. And the story of this, again, this is one of those things where there's a million different versions of this, but if you piece together some of the coherent parts of it, how you transmute the king is that you return him to his beast nature, his animal nature, his instinctual nature. And one of the ways of doing this is providing him with an eye charmer, an eye candy that's a woman, the Scarlet Woman, the whore, right? And so, again, right on cue, Marilyn Monroe comes out for "Happy Birthday, Mr. President," and then, whatever happened. But that's kind of like the idea is that there's a trap laid for the king to return to his sexual primal nature. And that's like, if you see the tarot card of strength, you see the woman petting the beast, the king, the Lion King. And in Crowley's version is lust, which is the woman riding the Lion King, right? So there's like the duality of the woman, Mary. And then you see these weird dualities in like the Zapruder film, where you, at the beginning of the Zapruder film, it starts out kind of pretty, like a garden. It corresponds to a lot of tarot cards. If you look at the Magician card in tarot, the first one, it's got a rose garden. It's kind of like a color motif of red and white. And you see that color motif at the beginning. And there's this girl named Rosemary Willis who comes out. She must be like, I don't know, 9, 10, 11-year-old girl. She's dressed in red and white. She has like a white sweatshirt and red shorts or a dress. And her name is Rose Mary, right? So the red and white roses, and then Mary, right? Kind of like the virgin, innocent Mary. And then later on, just before the assassination, he's killed when he passes the dark Mary, Mary Mormon, right? More black, and she's dressed in black. And then the other girl, the lady in red, is Norma Jean Norma Jean Hill, and Marilyn Monroe's actual name is Norma Jean Mortensen. So what a strange correspondence where you have like the black harlot Madonna in her colors of black and red just before the kill shot, but you started out with the duality of the more virgin, innocent Rosemary Willis and the innocent colors. And so that's the duality of Mary that Carl Jung talks about. And you can see that in the namesake of the people in the event and the colors they dress in. And I can't say that that's coincidence, you know?
That's fascinating how all that can just be a part of this event, and how much that event affected, humanity after that. It had such a large, profound effect on people in general.
Yeah, for sure. And to tie it back into what we were talking about, JFK is really the only Catholic president ever. So that's very important to people who want to destroy Christendom or transmute it. That's really what it is. It's about transmutation. And that's what alchemy is. You've taken the old king, the old Christendom, the old Saturn or authority, and you're transmuting it into the new one. And so during that event, that was in the 1960s, that was right when Vatican II was happening. That was right when all the sexual revolution, you have all this stuff, the rise of modern feminism, just transmuting society and its values as a whole. And JFK was kind of like the catalyzing moment of that. And you're basically taking the old Christ of Catholicism and you're transforming it into the new Christ, which again, the Talmud, they refer to the Talmud as God in the flesh, or the Alpha and the Omega. These are all terms for Christ, right? And so if you're transmuting Christ, then you're going to use all these Christ symbols. So they have the higher Masonry, that's Christ to them. You have the death and resurrection of Osiris, and you have this ritual based upon Io, Isis, Apophis, Osiris, and Crowley magic. There's a lot of Crowley stuff involved in this. The Daily Plaza North and South routes are 77. So there's 2 77s on each pillar. If you apply that to Crowley magic, 77 is an important number, and Babylon and all that stuff. And so the point is that he's a Catholic king in namesake, let's say, not so much behavior. And he's the only president that's really been portrayed as a king, right? The king of Camelot. And Camelot goes back to Arthurian legends, which are tied to Catholicism and medieval chivalry, stuff like that. And so interesting how he was transmuted in that event where you have a death, and this is alchemy. You poison, or you go to the Negredo, you intentionally destroy something, and then you resurrect it in the new form that you want it to be. And so JFK's eternal flame was lit, right? The flame of Prometheus, the torch, you're resurrecting it symbolically. And then you had Jackie Kennedy dressed in like the mourning veil of like Isis, and she was in between her 2 children for these iconic photographs, the 2 Gemini twins. It basically reflected the High Priestess tarot card, but just the mourning veil. And so that's a ritual in Crowley land. Isis is Jackie Kennedy, Apophis or Set is Oswald the Destroyer, and Kennedy is Osiris. And there's all these strange things associated with Oswald and Pan, or the scapegoat. He is literally the scapegoat. That's part of the ritual, right? And so Oswald, if you look up the meaning of Oswald, it means divinely powerful god of the forest in English surname. And it's like, well, that's what Pan is. Isn't that really weird? All these crazy
that is crazy
correspondences. And again, you have to go through the series to see the depth of it all. But the point being is that this is what you do to transmute the old Osiris into the new one. This is what concept that Manly Palmer Hall talks about. The new Osiris is the resurrected, more perfect, divine Osiris. And so to me, this is just simply the Apollo 11 moon mission, because JFK was the one who initiated everyone into the idea of going to the moon, whether people believe that we did or not. He was the initiatory force, right? We choose to go to the moon. And so that was fulfilled through the Apollo 11 event, allegedly. And what is that? It's a giant obelisk a flaming obelisk shooting off into space to unite with the moon, the virgin moon that no man has ever touched before, right? A new virgin birth. And then that births the universal religion of science, right? Everyone's enamored with science. This is the greatest achievement of mankind. And now the Prometheus God is the new God. So you transmuted it from the old Christ, the old God of Catholicism and the Holy Roman Empire and Christendom, to now it's the Freemasonic Christ of technology and Promethean evolution, basically.
That is fascinating. Now, for the last few minutes we live in very fascinating times. I'm seeing things that I never thought I'd see before, but there's this weird polarity going on where there's rampant censorship on one side, and then we have this whole QAnon weird thing going on where people are supposedly waking up. What do you think? What does it look like to you in the next few years as to how it relates to the way they're trying to push us?
Oh boy, that's a tall order. I think that there's definitely something big on the horizon, but I don't mean to be like alarmist about it or anything like that. I think it's just a lot of it is just very much a consciousness shift. And I also, I do astrology. I'm kind of on hiatus right now, retooling some things, but I know a lot about astrology basically. And so there's an interesting cycle that's ending right now. Pluto, whether you believe it's a planet or not, whatever, in astrology, when something returns to its original point of an event, it's seen as very important. So for example, every time you celebrate your birthday, that's a solar return. Your sun is returning to the point where you were born on the zodiac. And so that's why the sun represents you, yourself. It's kind of like your ego in a way. And so that's why your birthday is all about you, right? So you ironically, when you celebrate a birthday, you're actually kind of practicing astrology. You just don't really know it. And same thing with a Saturn return. That's every 20 to 30 years. And so that's about reaping and sowing. And so if you've not, if you just kind of party your ass off, didn't really, take responsibility, you're going to get that back to you when you're 28 or 30. And a lot of people go through a crisis where, oh shit, I just kind of party a lot in my 20s and now I'm trapped because I don't have money or I'm in debt or whatever, college. It happens to a lot of people. I mean, it happened to me on certain levels, not to those extents, but probably a lot of people can identify with that. So the further out the planet is, the more intense it is. And so when you get out to the generational planets like Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, they move very, very slowly through the zodiac. And so these are why they're seen as generational. They encompass generations. So for example, the 60s generation, Pluto was for the most part in the sign of Virgo. And again, Virgo is like the virgin or the mother, the church, right? That's the allegory of the church. It's the woman. And so you're transmuting the church during that time through Vatican II and stuff like that. So the divine fire, the divine spark, again, that's like, it's a burning bush basically. But how do you interpret the burning bush? The Talmud will interpret that very differently than Catholicism or, even maybe Freemasonry. But Freemasonry would probably be more in line with the Kabbalah. But the point being is that's like the divine fire of God. And so you're monitoring cycles. And I'm not espousing astrology in a divinatory way. I'm not espousing it in a predicting this will happen. I don't do any of that. To me, that's all, I don't jive with any of that. But the point is, this Pluto cycle, the founding of America, 1776, Pluto was in, I think it's 28 degrees, 29 degrees Capricorn, 27, I can't remember. It's around the end of Capricorn. So now it's coming back around where it's approaching its original point at the founding of America. So in theory, this event would be very important to America as a whole. And America really kind of dictates what the rest of the world does. We're the American dream that everybody looks at, whatever you think about it, dream for some, nightmare for others. But so that's really like symbolically saying the divine fire of God, the real God, is coming around, and Pluto's a planet of judgment. And so what is, again, judgment's a word. How do you define it? What is a judgment to somebody? But these are some things to think about. The astrology correspondence is there, whether you believe in astrology to have legitimacy or not, but the elites certainly monitor it. So they might have their own viewpoint on judgment. They might try to enact some of that, but are they the ones who are really in control, and will they be able to do that? And I think that gets around to free will. I do believe, and this is in accordance with Catholic teaching, we all have free will. And that's why I don't believe in the astrology that says otherwise. I don't practice it. I don't mess with it. And people are free to do so if they want, but for me, that's just not what I do. And so I think it indicates there is a collective. We all have a relationship to the collective. And so our free will impacts the people around us. And so I think it's going to be an interesting time with that cycle, whether there is validity to astrology or not. The elites will be viewing it and probably trying to perform some shenanigans based on that. I don't know what it would be. But it could be also a time for powerful change if people, I think, get back to healthier ways of being and are able to view the deception. And I think, like you said, the QAnon stuff, even though I'm really suspicious of all those sorts of things, to me, Trump represents people at least looking back to tradition on some level, whether he's a complete puppet, whether he's sort of on the outskirts but still control, whatever you think about what he actually is, I don't even really care. I don't get Trump triggered when he says something stupid. I don't overly promote him. I just think he's there because that is just a reflection of the state of America. I think that's what I think the rulers kind of are. It's kind of like the collective people. It gets kind of like personified in a way in a ruler. So in some way, when you overly criticize the rulers, in some way, you're probably actually criticizing yourself, and you want to blame everything on the president, right? That's kind of a trap we all fall into. And so I think it's just simply a time where people are looking back and be like, you know what, maybe the way we used to do things was better and healthier. And everyone's telling us we got to move forward and do all this stuff. But I think we're seeing a lot of the things coming to fruition, especially the founding principles that our country was founded on. I'm not saying I'm not saying do away with the Bill of Rights or anything like that. I'm just saying that there was a lot of Freemasonic deistic principles built into the founding of America. And I think that some of those principles, despite sounding nice, are coming to their logical conclusion now. And we're seeing the monster that it creates. And we might have to rethink some of these things. And so I try to be positive, and I think that we need to do our best to try to deal with the fact that maybe there is an objective morality that we should try to be striving for or alluding to. And I think that that's where going back to some of the tradition that we've been programmed to think is evil and repressive, maybe actually sometimes those things are liberating, and the things that tell us that are liberating is actually what's oppressive and enslaving us, even though it's disguised as freedom and liberation. And how many wars end up getting fought because of that very notion, right?
Very well said. And man, that is some deep stuff. Everybody, you have to go check out your YouTube. That is Schism 206, right?
Yes, sir. And I have a Twitter account that I just post whatever's new. I'm not super active on it. People can feel free to email me. I also, in my research, I'm going to be creating a website. It's kind of in the works right now, and I'm gonna have a paid member section. It's not going to be super expensive, pretty standard for what probably other people charge, and that will allow me to really dig into a lot of the stuff a bit better. And also the astrology stuff will be coming back at some point. So if anybody looks into the research, they like it enough to be like, hey, I'm interested in the paid member section, or maybe I might be interested in astrology reading in the future, feel free to email me. I don't respond to comments. I don't have time. I need to try to get away from the computer as much as possible, but I am very open to people contacting me if they'd like. And so, you could follow on Twitter, subscribe on YouTube, and then look out for more stuff in the future with a whole new website and the paid members stuff.
Definitely. Well,
one last thing. The podcast, it's on hiatus right now. I think I have like 16 or 17 episodes. People can check those out. Again, some of the older content, my mindset has shifted a bit, but I think it's still relevant. And the best way I can describe it is, before, it was very neutral without any real narrative. It was just observing and connecting things and showing the connections and how deeply entrenched all the esoteric stuff is. And now it's more shifted to the narrative of the battle of Western civilization with, again, the power struggle of the old and the new world. I have my own opinions on it. You can disagree with them on it, but I do believe that that power struggle and battle is reality, regardless if you choose a side or reject both of them.
Very good. No, that is great information. And I want to thank you again for coming on tonight. We're going to have you back on.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, you have a great night.
You too.